The most iconic story of Jesus as a servant comes from John 13, the foot washing. The timing of this event is unique. Jesus washes his disciples' feet the night before he goes to the cross. This almost sacramental display was perhaps his most memorable act of service, beyond, of course, going to the cross for their sakes. It is a striking act, but if it was such an important act of service, why did he wait until the night before his death to do it? Let's look more closely. We're reading from John 13, verses 1 through 17. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. During supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know what I am doing now, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. For very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." So how is Jesus a servant in this passage? And how is Jesus a leader in this passage? Perhaps it feels that these questions are too obvious. Of course, Jesus is a servant by washing the disciples' feet, and he is a leader by teaching them about servanthood. But let's think a little bit more deeply about this passage. One way Jesus is a leader in this passage is by understanding his hour had come, and that he was soon facing death and departure from his disciples. He could no longer wait for them to absorb his teaching through slow, consistent modeling. He chose to do something to catch their attention and fix their memories. With his approaching death, his concern could have been on his impending suffering. He could have sought sympathy from them and support for the heroic choice he had already made to seal his fate. Instead, he thought about his disciples and what they needed this night. Have you ever wondered why Jesus washed their feet? If it was an act of servanthood, and servanthood is good, why hadn't he been washing their feet all along? Why did he wait until the end to do it? On the other hand, did people even want their feet washed? Were they grateful Jesus washed their feet? Finally, someone is washing my feet. Jesus, it's about time. No, I don't think so. In fact, Peter has a real problem with what Jesus is doing, and I think the others were less vocal, but probably felt the same way. In all the Gospels, Peter is the mostest disciple. He's the one who will say what everyone else is only a little bit thinking. He's the one to announce Jesus as the Messiah, but he's also the one to rebuke Jesus for speaking about his own death. He's the one to ask Jesus to command him to get out of the boat and walk on water. And here in John 13, it is clear that Peter was not the first to get his feet washed. He is silent, but likely disgusted when his fellow disciples, perhaps including his younger brother Andrew, allow Jesus to wash their feet. He is silent as, one by one, they allow their rabbi and Lord to disgrace himself by performing this lowly act. But he can say silent no more when Jesus comes around to him. "You shall never wash my feet." It is worth noting that Peter contradicts his Lord, but in part because Peter has high esteem, deep loyalty, heartfelt love for Jesus, misguided though it is. Peter, in his loyalty, would not let Jesus stoop to wash Peter's feet, as it was unbecoming of Jesus' high authority and greatness. But of course, the other disciples had not objected. Jesus' actions undoubtedly discomfited them. They were not bold enough to contradict their Lord. That task fell, as it often did, on Peter. But Peter also resists Jesus' leadership here, I believe, because it seems like an inversion. If Jesus had asked Peter to wash his feet, I think that would have been more comfortable for Peter. As Jesus says later, servants are not greater than their master. Peter thinks of himself as a servant of Jesus and would not expect to be served by his master. This is a common error, and it takes a trial, denial, a death, and resurrection for Peter to really get this. Jesus came not to be served, but to serve. Peter contradicts Jesus twice in this short passage. First, he announces that Jesus will never wash him. Then, after Jesus' insistence, he says, "Well, Lord, if that's the case, then I have a better idea. Wash all of me." Of course, that wasn't Jesus' plan either, and Jesus dismisses his kooky but enduring expostulation, and eventually Peter submits and allows Jesus to carry out his plan. So how is Jesus a leader in this story? First of all, by knowing the hour. He knew what would happen and that this night was the proper time for this dramatic display and teaching. Secondly, by leading Peter. Jesus had a plan and kept to it. He served Peter, but on Jesus' terms. Jesus was a servant leader, not a servant servant. He served Peter, but he didn't allow Peter's misguided loyalty and stunted vision to cause him to swerve from Jesus' own plans or intentions for Peter's sake. Finally, Jesus was a leader by modeling servanthood and calling them to it. Though he knew he was facing brutal death, he focused on serving them. He loved them to the end. How then is Jesus a servant in this story besides the obvious? First of all, by being patient with Peter. He persuades rather than forces Peter to follow his lead. Secondly, by washing even the betrayer's feet. Judas didn't leave until verse 30 after receiving the foot washing. Finally, by explaining his model. Jesus explains what he has done for them and why. His actions were not self-interpreting. Suppose Jesus had not interpreted what he had done. Suppose instead Jesus finished washing the disciples' feet and then returned to his place at the table. Suppose he asked them to guess what they should do in response. Okay, guys, you call me teacher and Lord. I've washed your feet, so... He waits a few seconds for emphasis. I've washed your feet, so... ... Peter would have jumped up. Oh, I get it. You wash our feet, so we should wash your feet, me first. At that point, everyone would have been glad to wash Jesus' feet, especially after Peter first washed off most of the dirt. Because, well, reciprocity is natural. It's built into human nature. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. You wash my feet, I wash yours. But of course, if they had concluded that, that would have been a disappointing outcome. If Jesus washed the disciples' feet only to get his own feet washed, it would have ended there. Instead, he wanted to start a foot-washing chain where people didn't get paid back through reciprocity, but rather that his disciples would pay it forward through multiplication. He didn't want his feet washed. He wanted something much more significant. He wanted to start a cascade of foot-washing servanthood that would ripple out through the community and down through the centuries, shaping and transforming individuals, groups, churches, and entire cultures. The disciples in that upper room could not possibly have imagined the far-reaching implications of this action and call. I serve you, now you serve others in my name. Jesus served his disciples most obviously by washing their feet, but their feet would get dirty again, soon and often. His much greater act of servanthood dwarfed his small act of practical service. He taught them that the blessing is in the serving. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. God's blessing doesn't come from receiving servanthood as much as being a servant. To those unfamiliar with Jesus and his ways, this seems counterintuitive. It may seem unnecessary even to mention to us who may be familiar with Jesus' teaching and model, but this was the revolutionary insight of the night. Not just the call to be servants, but the secret gift inside that call. The blessing is found in the serving. This insight is fundamental. Jesus did not challenge his disciples to stop seeking blessing, instead only to serve. Rather, he uncovered for them the secret of his life of continual service. The biggest blessing is indeed saved for the one who is the biggest servant. This insight would fund the rapid growth of a servant posture on the parts of his disciples in the rapid expansion of the early church. So, since we are not Jesus, how can we lead like Jesus? I get the serving part, but how do we know what is needed when we did not originate from God in the way Jesus did, nor do we already have ready access to his divine knowledge? Well, we do have access to knowledge, more than we might think. The access to information, combined with a readiness to use it to serve others and not manipulate them, for example, allows us to be servant leaders following the model of our Lord. A leader serves by seeing. In this passage, we see two ways Jesus sees more deeply than his followers. This gives him the lead that allows him to be a leader, because he sees what his followers do not and can help them take steps forward while serving them rather than forcing or manipulating them. Jesus had insight and foresight. We too have access to both insight and foresight. Not perfectly, divinely as Jesus did, but in our own ways, as I'll explain. These tools can help us to become better servant leaders. Insight. A leader sees more deeply than followers and helps them to see. Jesus had insight into Peter's hesitation to participate in the foot washing. While he was patient with Peter, he insisted that his plan, not Peter's plan A, no washing at all, or plan B, wash all of me, was acceptable. Jesus also had insight into his disciples, that most were clean, but that one did not have a pure heart and would betray him. Secondly, foresight. A leader sees further down the road than followers and acts on it. Jesus knew that Peter would not understand what he was doing. He said, later you will understand, because Jesus had a plan to explain it to him. So while Peter was protesting, Jesus patiently explained in ways that Peter would eventually come to appreciate. What does insight and foresight look like for us? When we notice an unspoken need and act to meet it before being asked to do so. Attentiveness to the unspoken, beneath the surface needs of others is a powerful way we can use insight to serve. We use foresight when we think not only about present needs, but future needs, or consequences to present actions being considered, or future opportunities we can help people to take advantage of. So for us, we need to grow in and come to benefit from insight and foresight. How can you develop insight and foresight? Keep your eyes open. Your ability to serve is limited by what you can see. So first, pray and ask God for wisdom and insight. Pray by name for people you lead. Insight and foresight might come in prayer or come later after your prayer. Listen to those promptings and thank God for his wisdom. Secondly, watch other leaders and ask them why they made their choices. You can learn from other people's experiences as well as your own mistakes. Finally, reflect on what has worked and what hasn't in your own life. All it takes to be a servant leader is to really see people and ask them to tell their stories and listen to what they're willing to share with us. If we know these things, we are blessed if we do them. Don't forget to like and subscribe. As I was preparing this video and working with all these classical artists' renditions of the foot washing, I noticed that they all made the same mistake the disciples made, and especially Peter, in that they could not conceive of Jesus without his robe. They could not conceive of Jesus without the majesty that they intended to communicate about him through their painting. So they all had a picture of Jesus washing the disciples' feet with his full robes on. The text tells us he took off his outer robe, so he would just be in his underwear, which you'll notice the bronze statue at the beginning of this video portrays him in exactly that way, and that's my favorite representation of this story. Just wanted to point that out. I invite you to go back and rewatch the video looking at the images with that insight in mind.